Hello, Christine.
Hey,
Hello. Thank you so much for joining us today on A Bit Lit.
thank you.
We're really thrilled that you're here to talk to us a little bit about your new book that came out this year, um, and about some of the future work that might be stemming out from it. I wondered if we might begin by you just introducing yourself to our viewers and what you do.
Yeah, I'm Christine Varnado. I'm an assistant professor of gender and sexuality studies at the State University of New York in Buffalo. And The Shapes of Fancy is my first book, just came out. It's such a beautiful edition from the University of Minnesota Press. And I worked on it for years and years. It started out as my doctoral dissertation at Columbia, and has just morphed and changed. And now I hope we'll get to speak in new ways to the new times that we keep being in. Historical change is one of the big problems I'm trying to kind of pull out and figure out in the book, and Lord, but historical change keeps coming at us.
It feels like it's happened very rapidly over the course of months and weeks. Great. Well, I wondered, I guess, whether a good place to start would be the way that you finish the book, to kind of turn this around and think backwards about it, because you finish the book with a real clarion call about what literature can do in these periods that you're talking about, these periods of big historical change, and for what reading literature can do for students now who are trying to think about those periods, ones from the past and ones as they kind of unfold now. So I wondered if you might say a word or two about how you think what you do, and I suppose what lots of our colleagues do in writing these kind of works and in teaching literature, can do to revivify reading, which is how I think how you phrase it, and why that's important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I really saw the book ultimately as about the question of reading for desire. I really ended up at a very kind of long-lived and fundamental claim of literary theory, of reader response theory by the end of the book, that the idea that one cannot but read as oneself, and that the reading subject is a cluster of desires and historically contingent experiences, and of the texts that you've already read, and that there's no other way to read. And that's such a kind of fundamental and primal practice. And that's what reading, that's the wonderful paradox, I think, of reading, is that it's so primal. It's one of the first human cultural activities we learn to partake in, and at the same time, it is so easily devalued and taken for granted and kind of shunted aside, particularly under capitalist conditions of austerity in our educational institutions, both for young people up to the age of 18 and in higher education. And the pandemic, I think, has really made visible not only how important the shared affective experience of reading is. I mean, it's one of the only cultural activities that hasn't been taken from us, right? That it's a form of remote sociality, remote connection that through which we can participate in a shared visceral experience. But the other thing the pandemic has made visible is it's given us this language of essential, by which it's impossible to miss that the most necessary activities to the sustenance of human life are the most easily devalued, and the least well compensated, care work and reproductive labor, sustenance labor. So in a way, by saying reading is essential to human culture, I mean, the pandemic has showed us that so-called essential work is often, the first to be devalued. I could say that reading is the essential activity, the essential work of human culture. So in these horrible, strange times, we often understand them as moments of historical change, as moments of opportunity where new social forms can come into being. But I'm also interested in the radical potential of very old forms of interaction. And in the book, I talk about old or passé or over forms of gender and sexuality. But I think reading and reading response theory and kind of old school close reading as a practice is another one of these forms that has maybe been thought of as over or passé or bygone or belonging to an earlier era. And my claim is that it's not. It's that it's more vital than ever, because texts ultimately outlive us and offer resources for understanding the past and resources for imagining possible futures. The imaginative archives of the past are, to me, what's interesting about them are all the ways in which they're undecided. All of the possible seeds of alternative futures that may have been ignored or unnoticed in past historical moments. So that's why I think literary methodologies are particularly important right now, starting with that basic claim that we are reading as desiring subjects, reading from a position of desire, and reading for things that we desire to find in text, even if we're not sure in advance exactly what those are going to be.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, what I'm really struck by and what I really like about that position of reading text is that it captures the value of looking at something that is, however many decades old, however many centuries old, whilst, as you're saying, sort of really being centered on the effective responses of a person in the moment who's reading it. I wondered if you might say a little more about the way that your book tackles that approach, which is to use this lens of queerness, or the term queerness, and I suppose the way you define it within the book, in order to do that kind of reading work.
Yeah. I mean, I think what I'm saying, in my first answer, I phrased it as a kind of benefit to human culture, like resources of pleasure, resources of connection, resources of figuring out how to use the archives of the past to imagine possible futures. But the desire that's inherently a part of reading is also the fount of all scholarship ever. I believe that anyone who has produced knowledge from historical archives about the past is doing it out of that motivated, desirous place. And so my argument in the book is about how we talk about erotic desire from the past and how we talk about queerness. And that's a great term that it had a life where it just meant weird. And then it in the 20th century was a terrible slur for gay activities, gay people, and then was reclaimed circa 1990 by a radical political wing of the gay and lesbian liberation movement, a radical politics, an organization called Queerness, wanted to protest against the assimilationist politics of that moment in the gay and lesbian rights movement. And so I think there's a lot to say about how we apply that term to texts and desires from the past. So how I saw it and why I felt the need to write this book is that I saw it as a kind of tentacle of or ray of energy, or a kind of energetic thread that sort of snakes out and swerves in some direction that's not where that energy or desire was expected to go. And this doesn't have to happen within an individual subject or within an individual like dyadic erotic relation. A strange directionality of desire, or an impossible or secret kind of angle of desire. So there are 4 specific forms of queerness that the book explores. The desire to be used to others' ends, the refusal to settle on an object of desire, the promiscuous desire to take in everything, a paranoid desire that makes true what it suspects or what it fears, and then the impossible longing to be transformed into something you can never become in order to have something you can never have. So those are 4 very specific moods, I guess, or structures that I saw recurring through early modern texts. And my argument in the book is that those constitute a form of queerness, a very finite, specific set of queer affects that aren't necessarily locatable in same gender or same sex relations, although the only way I can recognize those turns of affective weirdness is that they're all connected to the histories of same-sex desiring and other sexually dissident people and cultures. Refusals of monogamy, refusals to settle on socially appropriate partners, embraces of masochism, impossible longings. I mean, they're recognizable through gay and lesbian history and all the centuries of queer desiring subjects history. So the fact that they take place at the level of a scene or a mood or a structure, it's not unmoored from the history of queer desiring subjects. But my intervention in the book is just that there are more ways to talk about how we see queerness manifesting in literary texts than just looking at the dyadic or individual kind of subject relations.
I wonder if there's so much there that we'll want to talk about, I think, in a moment, but I wonder if I might ask just a little bit more about how locating it in that kind of structural sense of a text, what happens over the course of a play, for instance, several acts in a play and so on. How exactly you kind of do that? Maybe you have an example from the book you might want to talk about.
Richard Broom's The Antipodes. It's so meta. Not only do we have the altered consciousness with the protagonist, Peregrine, drugged and taken on a fake trip. You know, it's it's fantasy travel. It's drug travel, like a kind of artificial theatrical trip. But the protagonist, the reason he needs this trip is that he's reading too many travelogues to consummate his marriage. This is actually the perfect example, because the reason we're able to recognize Peregrine's predicament at the beginning of that play as a queer predicament is the whole history of subjects for whom heterosexual sex and marriage did not do it, you know, and who developed cultures of sly resistance against compelled heterosexual sex and marriage, often through literature and through fantasy and through the desire to be elsewhere, to be someone else. So then the play goes into the theatrical space, the space of the pretend trip to the Antipodes, and it just keeps getting queerer and queerer. It's not only obviously the social inversion stuff is, you know, misrule and the world upside down, but then the play actually offers a theory of how desire works. The Lord of Fancy, Lord Latoy, says in the book, ages before the fancies were begot, and shall beget still new to the world's end. Someone calls him the Lord of Fancy, and he's like, oh no, I'm not the Lord of Fancy. Ages before the fancies were begot, and shall beget still new to the world's end. So it actually has a theory that desire, that the nature of desire is to constantly be re-begetting and refreshing itself. And then ultimately it ends in a collective act, the act of marital, we suppose, intercourse that Peregrine ultimately is kind of forced to do with his wife. It's so collective. I mean, it's literally collective. There's at least one other person, maybe two, in the room with them, and it's a kind of mock colonial marriage that's staged. So it's a really great example of how texts can just contain all these levels of structural queerness that are not only lodged in a protagonist, but in plots, in the way a text moves among settings, in the dynamics among characters, in the longings or affects expressed by characters, and in the ideas that the characters are positing. I'm almost reading every text in the book as speculative fiction. The way we read speculative fiction for the ideas, for its theories about how the universe is put together. Almost as though I'm reading a text that's set on another planet, and I'm looking for clues about, like, how does energy work on this planet? Or, you know, how does matter work? I'm trying to do that with desire in my practice of reading for desire, reading for how a text posits a specific system of how desire works.
That's really interesting. I mean, that sort of, the way that you kind of trace that through Latoy's use of fancy, which I suppose sort of structures, or certainly gives the term fancy gives the title to the book in some respects. I mean, you talk about, and as you just mentioned, doing that kind of reading, you have to sit between, you're expressly not doing a historicist inquiring. So that's part of this otherworldliness of inquiring for desire, I suppose. You're not just trying to find out what somebody may have done or felt in the past, but you're also not only doing a presentist reading. You're not just interested in immediate response. So I suppose fancy in that regard and the way it works in that example from the Antipodes, that kind of that maps onto that moment in which where the text comes from and what's contained in it is brought forward for a reader today, but the reader's also meeting the text too. Is that a fair way of sort of?
Oh my God, totally. Yeah, that's actually a really beautiful way of putting it. And I never thought of it in quite that temporal metaphor before, although I should have. The text and the reader are meeting in sort of a time out of time. It's like the lyrics of "There's a Place for Us" from the end of West Side Story. There's no real time in the way that we as organisms experience time for the text and the reader to meet. But with this reading practice it's neither solely concerned with what people thought about desire then, nor is it reading into reading present concerns and desires into a text. These dynamics exist in I call it in the book a meso level space. They are really there in the way that literary reading can reveal dynamics that are really there in a text. And literary methodology is the only one that I know of that's devoted to uncovering those imaginative, affective dynamics, those fantasies, those power dynamics, those violences, those weirdnesses at that level in a text. That's the method I think that's required to do this magic, where the everything that the text is and everything that the reader is can kind of meet in a time outside of time. That's a really beautiful image.
Yeah, I found it really useful sort of reading your work to think about how you can look beyond empirical inquiry into the past by using these kind of readings and approaches to imaginative texts, imaginative archives, as you put it earlier. I really like that. You're sort of using, as you just did, the Antipodes as an example. It made me want to ask a little bit more about the work you do with negative forms of affect in the book, because you're also not, you talked at the start about a few minutes ago about where the term queer came from, and it's the shape and etymology of queerness, and how it was redeemed and reclaimed in the early 90s by LGBTQIA+ groups. But you're also interested in the way that queerness can work negatively. And so you look at things like colonial writings in the book to do that. I wonder if you might want to say a bit more about why that's really important, to also reclaim this other side of what queerness is doing, the non-liberatory forms.
Yeah, that's really thorny and difficult. It's important to remember that the radical activists who reclaimed the term queer meant it in a kind of defiant, even antisocial way, as a corrective to what they saw as assimilationist liberal politics, and it's had a life as an anti-normative term of social critique that's incredibly important. But what sort of turned me around in how I was thinking about this is the work of a Native American historian and theorist, Mark Rifkin. His books are so fantastic. when did Indians become straight and beyond settler time? And through his work and through a question I asked him at a conference at UPenn, I realized that queer identification and queer affect and queer eroticism, queer erotic currents were a part of colonial desire that could not be ignored. And also a part of the persecutory desire of the witch panic. And that started me thinking about what politics, if any, necessarily attaches to the term queer. The other thinkers are kind of tugging at this now. Jasper Puar with her critique of homo nationalism and the way queerness is leveraged to imperial ends. And I ended up in a place where I was really struggling over, does queer desire have to be liberatory? And through the native theorists like Rifkin that I was reading, I realized that it absolutely isn't always liberatory, and that's a really important way of uncovering these dynamics in texts from the past that maybe haven't always been noticed in studies of Renaissance sexuality, Renaissance, gay or lesbian identity. And the other thing about that persecutory valence to queerness is that it's not over. It's not something that belongs to the past. It's still going on. Roy Cohn was Donald Trump's mentor. We are living right now in a political moment that is conditioned by persecutory, paranoid, imperialist, colonialist set of desires, some of which are queer.
Yeah, I think that's a really helpful way, again, I think, of explaining why reading the text that you read in the book are important now, but also what they can kind of offer as a thinking tool, a way to think with. I think you talk about those texts as a way to think with. That speaks directly to the worlds we're trying to reshape and I suppose now push new ideas into. I wonder if I might ask a question about another element of the readings that you do in the book. So as well as the kind of movement of structure and desire, and as part of doing that, your readings focus on the moments in which queer desire, forms of erotic energy, move beyond the actual human body and to some extent the human subject, to kind of engage with other forms of technology, prosthesis, items, objects of exchange, and so forth. And I mean, I for one am really, really interested in the way that kind of so items and object movements work. And just where I was personally in my work, I'm interested in new ways of trying to understand what, say, the affective or erotic energy of an object might be. So I found this really, really useful. And I wondered if you might want to say a word about why it's important to see, I guess, sexuality generally as something that's transhuman, that goes beyond the human body, and what it might mean to do that, I suppose.
Yeah, I'm so indebted to work in so many different conversations that thing theory, object-oriented ontology, Donna Haraway and her whole lineage of cyborg studies, Susan Stryker, the incredibly important trans theory, disciplinary conversation, This is a really central kind of concern of the book. It's also, I'm also indebted to conversations in disability theory about the role of objects in how humans negotiate the world. The privileging of flesh and of the discrete like parts of the natural human body that, as you know, that has a long violent history of, you know, which body parts, which acts are natural and which are deviant, uses of prostheses and objects in not only in daily life but in queer sex. So it ended up just being really integral to every chapter that human carcasses are not the only item involved in the circulation of eros, the circulation of any kind of affect or desire or energy, negative or pleasurable. And I think that's another reason I wanted to look at the kind of scene level or system level workings of desire. It is that I wanted to kind of see the organic and inorganic or natural and made stuff as all of the same kind of stuff as part of an erotic system.
Yeah, I really like that phrase of a kind of erotic system. And we were, yeah, I mean, I was thinking about other types of work in which the methodology that you kind of use here to read this transhuman exchange of erotic economy and erotic ecosystems. And I was thinking about, so one of the other things that you speak about at the end of the book is about the ability of this work and I guess your desire for this work to speak beyond the period in which these readings are taking place. These are kind of illustrative readings, but that the practice that they represent can be transported to, like, I guess, the affects within the text in question to other periods to study and to read their texts. And I wonder if we might talk about an example. So we kind of emailed a little bit before this conversation about how we might pick something rather completely sideways, you know, completely from a different time and period. And we came up with Paul Muldoon's poem from the early 1980s, Quoof. And I think for a number of reasons...
I was not familiar with. I'm so grateful to you for bringing that poem to my attention.
Oh, I think, yeah, it's a brilliant poem. And I don't know, I just, it was one of the first things I thought of. It's a poem I'm very fond of and kind of return to quite a lot. And so reading your work and having this, preparing for this kind of conversation, it made me think about this particular poem and the way that treats objects and the languages we use or the idioms we might use for those objects and how they're put into a particular kind of erotic system. And this is a very small poem itself, I guess, concerned with structure. It's a sonnet of sorts, I suppose. So it seemed to me way in the future to be, from these texts, to be speaking to similar sorts of issues. So I wondered if we might kind of talk about it, to think together about how the work that you're doing in the book could be transplanted and what it might mean to apply these methodologies to something else. That sounds good.
I mean, that's my dream for this book, is that readers will learn different things from reading it and using it than I learned from writing it. So this is a dream. And I love the idea of this poem speaking from the future to the texts in the book. I think one of the really central ways I've been thinking about all of these texts is that they're haunted from the future by all of the cultural currents and sexualities that were to come.
Yeah,
so yeah.
I really like that phrasing. So we're going to workshop it basically with this kind of haunting framework in mind. I think what we'll do is bring this up on the screen, and maybe I should read it through, and then we can kind of talk through the poem. So this is Quoof by Paul Muldoon. How often have I carried our family word for the hot water bottle to a strange bed, as my father would juggle a red-hot half-brick in an old sock to his childhood settle. I have taken it to so many lovely heads, or laid it between us like a sword. An hotel room in New York City, with a girl who spoke hardly any English, my hand on her breast, like the smouldering one-off spore of the Yeti, or some other shy beast that has yet to enter the language. So that's Quoof, a kind of, 14-line sonnet by Muldoon. And I think there's a great deal going on here, but I wondered if you might want to, I guess, start us off by how might we approach this with your practice in mind?
I love it. Well, one of the first things that sticks out is the title. This infantile word, this family word for the hot water bottle, quoof. I mean, it starts with the same sound as and letter as queer. It's an alien word that travels. It travels to people who've never heard it before, but it comes from a very primal place, and then the people to whom the speaker brings it get the word. Before you are initiated into the word, it's a nonsense word. The title of the poem actually queries the sense of language. It really makes it impossible to ignore that language is an arbitrary sign system. And so I think just formally, quoof and queer have a sort of parallel life, a word that you don't know until someone brings it to you in bed. And so that's for starters. And then the other amazing thing that the hot water bottle does, and you wrote me that you thought the erotic agency of the hot water bottle and the word for the hot water bottle was sort of what my work had started you thinking about. But both the hot water bottle and the word, when they're brought into these new sexual liaisons, to me they demonstrate that as I was just saying, I wanted to show that you can't see human, the natural human body and made material things as separable if they're part of the same system. To me, the hot water bottle and the word demonstrate that the family romance, like family of origin, psychic bonds are erotic bonds, and they're of a piece with the eventual adult sexual liaisons that we partake in. They're not like off in some universe by themselves. They're right there. They're part of the same system. And the water bottle and the word literalize that presence and that interpenetration of familial erotic bonds, the bonds between children and parents, the bond between the father and the son in the poem, and all of the various kinds of more recognizably erotic relations. So that's another thing that it does. And then this whole idea of carrying a word the way that one does an object. I think this poem is really, it's really about the erotic substance of language. A word as something that you carry. I love to think of my argument in this book as a model of, like, not only texts carrying words through time and the words taking on different resonances as the text travels through time, but also that as readers, we carry words. The way the speaker carries this word into all these different heads and beds, and you put it in people's bodies when you meet them, when you put it into their heads, and that's kind of the model from like Bart and Kristeva of reading that I lay out in the book's introduction, that as readers, we are constellations of words that we're carrying all the time. We're carrying them to the text that we read. So it's not just a text that carries words, it's a reader. And then the last thing maybe that I want to say is that there's another mysterious word at the end of the poem, like the smoldering one-off spoor, S-P-O-O-R, of the yeti or some other shy beast that has yet to enter the language. So quoof is the first word, like strange word, nonsense word that's kind of paired with queer. But then spoor, I had to look it up. I was like, what is spoor? And it's a track or a trace that you use to like track a beast through the wilderness. It can be a footprint track, but it can also be a scent track. So you're like sniffing after the spoor of the yeti, like the scent that it's like rubbed on trees that it leaves behind. So putting that, it's like it's the one-off spoor is an amazing phrase, because the spoor is introduced into the poem in this one-off way at the end, but it's actually just as important as quoof. They both have two O's. They're maybe pronounced slightly differently. We're not even sure. But the spoor is this scent that the beast leaves behind. And I think that's kind of what my methodology, my queer reading practice is trying to do, like track after maybe an intangible scent. I quote Joseph Litvak in the book, his work on scent, on the queer valences and racialized valences of scent. And Holly Dugan has written so beautifully about this in our field, that it's such a visceral sense. It's so connected to the psyche, to memory, to trauma, and that spoor is what the yeti is leaving behind in the last line of this poem. That the speaker is bringing the word into this strange bed, this strange girl in New York City, and it's like the scent that the mythical beast leaves behind, which means you have to track after it. Like that, this poem, I guess, feels like an attempt to track after the spoor of this word, quoof, this queer family word. I just think that's a really beautiful methodological image of tracking after the spoor of the yeti. I think that's kind of what I'm trying to do in my book. And then we have the yeti or some other shy beast that has yet to enter the language. And that's, of course, like all of the words that scholars of Renaissance sexuality have debated and gone around and around trying to figure out, you know, how to use a word that has yet to enter the language, like the Yeti. You could kind of see queer as the Yeti of Renaissance scholarship, according to the terms of this poem, because it has yet to enter the language, and yet it's obviously there, as you can perceive by sniffing after its spoor.
That is a fantastic kind of, not just a kind of a close reading of the poem, I suppose, but a way to turn the poem into a meditation on what it means to do close reading. So you sort of, a kind of reflexive way of reading it. I love that.
Through this family word. It's so moving.
And that sort of interest in idioms and the way that we might write an etymology of something or create an etymology of something that goes beyond defining very precisely what a word might mean, which I think, you know, you're also doing in the book, and the kind of the sense of what fancy stands for, as it changes meaning and as it might be applied in different areas. In some senses, what you presented with this poem is a form of fancy, a form of a definition of Quoof that the poem's trying to unpack by different angles.
And the other really important thing that I think the poem insists on, that I want to drive home in my work, is that it's communal. This making of meaning, the travel of this word, it has to happen in relation with other people, and other things, and other places. New York City, the Yeti. It's absolutely not an isolated or like discreetly contained within a single, you know, a single creative intellect or a single human subject. It can only happen in relation, as the word quoof is only developed in this intimate, primal parent-child relation.
That's great. I really enjoyed that, workshopping on air live a kind of a new way.
There's a really important politics to that, obviously, right? Like we're not individuals, we're interdependent.
And I like that sense of coming into being as well that the poem insists on. There's never a moment of coinage. The coinage is always some way off. It's always coming into the language. Thank you for that reading. I really enjoyed that. I will be continuing to think about Quoof, I think. I wondered if I might ask a question, I guess, moving this sense of thinking beyond what the book has done and what's in the book, because everybody needs to go and read that really to find out, and they must do it. And in fact, one way in which they can do it is by both getting the physical copy that you showed us earlier, but also by looking online, because University of Minnesota Press have done, I think, a fantastic job with the way that they've put the book together and made it accessible. So this is, you know, anybody can go and read this book. There aren't barriers of institutional access. And I just wanted to kind of hear more about that, about the process of doing it, why you wanted it to be accessible like that, and about how that might sit politically with other kind of work being done in queer studies.
Yes. I mean, I just got incredibly lucky that the University of Minnesota Press has this amazing open access platform called Manifold, where they're publishing cutting edge work in every discipline, in the humanities, free, where anyone can read it. And I think that only gets more important. I was putting in a request, a purchasing request for a bunch of new work in my various fields to a staff member at the SUNY Buffalo Library just the other day, and they said that only e-texts are being acquired at this moment. Because of the pandemic, obviously the people are working remotely and need to stay safe, but this is SUNY, so who knows when or if ever physical books will be acquired again for our library. And so the availability of my book just free on the internet, I think is absolutely crucial to what I call for in the conclusion, which is access to literary ways of knowing and imaginative texts and humanistic, aesthetic, and fantastical and futuristic and bygone and passé methodologies for everyone. I think it's very easy for us in the humanities to kind of succumb to an anxiety of legitimacy when we're constantly under the demand to prove, to quantify our reason for existing to the powers that be, which are different in your state and institutional context than they are in mine, but they exist for everyone. I think it's very easy to succumb to the kind of anxiety that empirical realities, especially violent ones, which God knows there are endless violent empirical realities, are kind of the only answer to why what we do is important. And they are an incredibly important part of the answer. They're maybe the preponderance of what I teach in my gender and sexuality studies classes: structural and historical violence, and the conditions of how things have been, how things currently are. And my contention in the book's conclusion is that if we're not teaching literary and humanistic ways of knowing, the kind of ways of reading that we've had the opportunity to talk about here for an hour, if we're not giving students that opportunity, we're denying them half of their full humanity, and we're denying them the font of resources for imagining a world otherwise. We're denying them the place from which ethical and reparative impulses and impulses of hope can spring. And my students are extremely aware of structural violence. They live under conditions of systemic racism, austerity, patriarchy, brutally exploitative capitalism. What I think everyone deserves, and what we in literary studies are uniquely able to give, is the literary side, the ways of knowing that can allow us to imagine a world that could have been otherwise and a world that could be otherwise. And so yeah, I think it's incredibly important to have texts where everyone can read them. It's also incredibly important to keep fighting to be allowed to teach that way, and to teach those methods, and to teach those subjects when all the machinery of austerity and higher education is arrayed against us.
Yeah. I mean, that's certainly being felt here in the UK, and I feel like, yes, the way that you lay out how essential it is to be able to teach it and to be able to learn it is really important, and it's really powerful. Yes, so thank you for kind of articulating it here as well in that sense. It's part of, I guess, what the body of A Bit Lit and all of the other contributors have come and talked to people on here are, I hope, kind of hammering home for people the breadth of what that might mean to do that work and learning, but how utterly essential it is where we are now. Yeah.
And you can do it with any text. You can do it with any canon. It's a practice of looking at how a piece of writing imagines the world.
Yeah.
And that's a desire-driven activity. That when you do that, you're exercising the muscle of your desire and your imagination. We need those.
Yes. I wonder, I mean, we've talked, I guess everything we've just been talking about is sort of encompassed in this question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. It's normally what we finish off asking people who come and talk on A Bit Lit, which is about that word literature. Yeah, I mean, how you've thought a lot, and the book is about what that affords, and as you said, the kind of urgency of it. I just wondered whether you had anything else to say about what literature means as a term, how useful it is, what you might do with that very precise and very charged word.
Yeah. In my very historicist education, I ended up settling on the word literature in the title of the book because I wasn't making an argument about any specific historical genre. I wasn't, I don't have a materialist argument about the early modern theater. In my chapters about colonial travel writing and witchcraft pamphlets, I'm extremely indebted to the brilliant work that's been done about information economies and how those texts circulated, but that wasn't the argument I was making about those genres as genres in the period. And so I ultimately realized that literature was the word I needed to use because I'm thinking about how we're reading these texts now. And I think any object, any textual object can lend itself to being read as literature when we're reading for desire, reading with desires sort of at the forefront of what we're looking for and what we're looking through, like a set of goggles, right? Like you can't but look through your own eyes, and you are a desiring subject. And that includes reading archives of atrocity, of historical violence. They can be read, and an enormous amount is added to our understanding of historical violence by reading those texts literarily. Or what figures are writers using? What kind of imagery are writers using to describe human bodies, or to describe what's happening, to describe the land? Looking at figuration and at the style of how a text holds up models of the world. I think that's kind of a practice-based definition of literature. The idea that it's in the reading, I guess, is not surprising coming from a conversation about this book.
That's great. I like that. I mean, I guess to round off, I'd ask where are you going now for this work? What's your kind of current and your future research focused on? And is there anything else you wanted to raise, I suppose, after what's
That's
a
so
really
exciting. Yeah. So the more I thought about how I think the central problem of this book is a question of legibility and interpretation, why we think we see what we think we see in texts. And so for my next project, I'm taking that into the realm of life. My next book is tentatively titled Queering Birth, Queering Death. And it's about how something that we call biological life enters and leaves the world. So what looks alive? What counts as alive? Why do we think we see or don't see life or aliveness in textual artifacts, in cultural artifacts? So it's going to be a lot about Macbeth and the problem of how life is generated in Macbeth, but it's also going to be about reproductive politics and the question of what counts as a life in conception, gestation, and birth and death. I can show you my vision wall. This is a set of images and artifacts that all sort of conjure different kind of liminal states of life from different cosmological traditions. I've got a lot of witches, plants, animals. Relax, it's not a real baby head. That's a photograph from a Buffalo artist. So that's what I'm working on. I'm thinking if I have an article from it out in a Bloomsbury Queer Shakespeare collection about the weather in Macbeth. And for the death section, I was looking at bone churches and crypts. There's a particularly early ornamental bone catacombs in Rome built by Capuchin brothers. But just as I started working on that, the pandemic hit. So I'm not yet exactly clear on what the role of mass death and state neglect is going to be in the queering death section. I guess time will tell.
It's very exciting to have a literal snapshot of your of your kind of research process here, and I'm certainly looking forward to hearing and reading more about what comes out of that project.
I'm so glad to get to talk to you.
Oh, this has been a pleasure. Thank you so much for coming on and talking about this excellent book. And we will have links up so that people can go and follow it and read it.
Oh, to the manifold open access.
Indeed, yes. And the other resources mentioned. Absolutely, yeah. So this has been great. Thank you very much, Christine.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Callan. It's really fun.
I look forward to speaking soon. Hopefully in person at some point.
Oh, God willing, right? It would be really great. I hope I get to meet you.
Likewise. Have a lovely afternoon.
You too. Take care. Bye.